The question came without warning, the way dangerous things always do. Vera Dunne was carrying a tray of coffee cups through the hallway of the Hargrove Grand when a man she'd never spoken to stopped her with 2 words. "Miss Dunne." She turned. She knew who he was. Everyone on staff knew who Luca Marzetti was, but she'd never heard him say her name before, never thought he'd noticed her at all. She was 26 years old, 260 pounds, and had worked at the Hargrove Grand for 3 years without being noticed by anyone who mattered. That was the job. That was the point. You moved quietly, you kept your head down, and you made sure the powerful men in the private rooms never had to look at you twice. But Luca Marzetti was looking at her now. He stood in the doorway of the East Corridor, the one that connected the hotel's public lobby to the private event wing where the real money gathered. He was 51, silver at his temples, and wore a suit that probably cost more than Vera's rent for a year. He wasn't handsome in the way that made you comfortable. He was handsome in the way that made you careful. "You overheard something last night," he said. Not a question. Vera's grip tightened on the tray. "I didn't hear anything, Mr. Marzetti." He watched her for a long moment. The hallway was empty. The carpet was thick, and the walls were old, and the whole place had the particular silence of buildings that had absorbed too many secrets over too many years. "Walk with me," he said. She didn't say no. You didn't say no to Luca Marzetti, not if you understood what he was and what that meant. Vera understood. She'd grown up in the 9th Ward of New Orleans, in a neighborhood where understanding these things wasn't optional. It was survival. She set the tray on a side table and walked. She had not intended to overhear anything. That needed to be said, even if only to herself. She'd been restocking the service cart in the alcove, off the Jasmine room, at 11:40 the previous night when 2 men entered through the side door. She recognized one of them, Ferretti, the thin man who always sat at Marzetti's left hand during dinner. She didn't know the other one. They spoke in low voices, but the alcove had a particular acoustic quality that the architects had probably never intended. Vera heard everything. She heard the name of the man they wanted to hurt. She heard where they planned to do it. She heard that Ferretti had already been paid half and would receive the rest after. Then she heard Ferretti say something that made her go completely still. He said that Marzetti himself had arranged it. That was the part she'd spent all night turning over, because it didn't fit. She didn't know Luca Marzetti well, had never exchanged more than 12 words with him in 3 years, but she knew things the way she always knew things, by watching, by listening, by being the kind of person no one bothered to guard themselves around. And what she knew about Marzetti was that the man they were discussing, a man named Carver, was someone Marzetti trusted. Had trusted for years. She'd seen them together. She'd noticed. The story didn't add up. But that was not her business. She had a job. She had rent. She had a mother in Metairie with a bad knee and a fixed income and medical bills that didn't care about anyone's criminal politics. She had told herself all of this very firmly at midnight, and again at 2 in the morning, and again when her alarm went off at 6. Now she walked beside Luca Marzetti through the hotel's garden corridor, past the fountain that had been broken for 8 months and the potted palms that needed watering, and she waited. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Okay, and I want you to answer me honestly, not the way people answer when they're scared. The real answer." She almost laughed at that. "I'll do my best." He stopped walking. They were at the end of the corridor, near the door that opened onto the private courtyard. He turned to face her, and for the first time she looked at him directly, without the practiced blankness she usually kept in place around guests. He looked tired, not the kind of tired that came from a late night, the kind that came from a long time. "If you found out that someone close to me was planning something against me," he said, "and you had information that could stop it, what would you do with it?" Vera looked at him. She thought about the careful answer, the safe answer, The answer that would get her out of this hallway without consequence. She had several to choose from. She'd been preparing them since midnight. Then she thought about Ferretti's voice, low and satisfied, and the way the other man had laughed. "I'd wonder," she said slowly, "whether you'd actually believe me, or whether you'd assume I was the one trying to cause trouble." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "Why would I assume that?" he said. She held his gaze. "Because I'm the cleaning woman, Mr. Marzetti, and you've never looked at me before today." The silence stretched long enough that she began to count her heartbeats. "What did you hear?" he said. Vera Dunne had not planned on being brave. Bravery, in her experience, was mostly just desperation that had run out of other options. She'd grown up watching brave people and what happened to them, and she'd made a different choice. Stay quiet, stay small, stay useful. Don't be the person the room notices. She was very good at it. She was good at it because she'd had to be. Because being 260 pounds in a city that had opinions about, that meant learning early how to preempt the dismissal, how to be efficient enough and invisible enough that people got what they needed from you before they had the chance to decide you weren't worth their attention. She'd turned it into a skill. She'd turned it into armor. What she had not anticipated was that the armor would one day be worth something. She told Marzetti what she'd heard, all of it. She kept her voice steady and her eyes on his face, and she watched him absorb each detail with the stillness of someone who had spent decades becoming unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're certain it was Ferretti? I've refilled his water glass 40 times. I know his voice. And you're certain what he said about my name?" "Yes," she paused. "Which is why I don't think it's true." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said carefully, "that if you'd arranged it, Ferretti wouldn't need to say so out loud to someone in a hotel hallway at midnight. Men who are doing what they're supposed to be doing don't explain themselves in corridors." She stopped. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." "No," he said quietly. "Keep going. He's not doing your work," she said. "He's doing someone else's, and using your name to make it clean." Marzetti looked at her for a long time. She couldn't read his face. She could read most people. It was another thing she'd gotten good at in self-defense, but his face was a locked room. Finally, he said, "How long have you worked here?" 3 years. And before that, 2 years at the Montclair. Before that, I cleaned offices downtown. Before that, I was a checkout cashier at a grocery store on Magazine Street. She kept her voice even. "I'm not anyone, Mr. Marzetti. I just happened to be in the wrong alcove at the wrong time." "Or the right one," he said. She went back to work. She didn't know what else to do. She finished her shift. She restocked the carts. She replaced the towels in the third-floor suites. She fixed the television remote in 408 that had been reported broken twice without anyone actually checking the batteries. She did all of it with the focused automaticity of a person trying very hard not to think. She thought, anyway. She thought about what Marzetti would do with what she'd told him. She thought about whether Ferretti would find out she'd talked. She thought about her mother's phone call from Sunday, the one about the specialist appointment, and the number the specialist had mentioned, a number that sat somewhere between impossible and simply very, very difficult. She thought about the fact that she'd just told a man who ran organized crime operations across 3 states something that could get her killed, and she'd done it because she'd looked at his face and decided to tell him the truth. She had no explanation for that decision that satisfied her. At 4 in the afternoon, she was in the basement laundry room folding tablecloths when she heard footsteps on the stairs. She kept folding. She'd learned not to look up at footsteps. The footsteps stopped. "Miss Dunne." It was Marzetti's voice. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway of the laundry room, which was fluorescent lit and smelled of detergent and was absolutely the most incongruous place she had ever seen a van like him. He looked faintly absurd, and he clearly knew it, and he came in anyway. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Okay. I looked into what you told me." He was choosing his words with the deliberateness of a man who didn't often have to choose them carefully. "You were right about Ferretti. He's been running a separate arrangement for the past 4 months, with a man named Solis, who has reasons to want Carver removed." He paused. "And reasons to want it tied to my name." Vera nodded slowly. She didn't say anything. "You saved someone's life today," he said. "I just said what I heard. You also told me what you thought," he said. "That's different. Most people in your position would have either said nothing or told me exactly what I wanted to hear. You said what you actually believed." He looked at her steadily. "Why?" She thought about it honestly. "Because you asked me to." A pause. "That's it? You said you wanted the real answer, not the scared one." She folded the corner of a tablecloth with unnecessary precision. "I figured you probably knew the difference." She found out later, from one of the other housekeeping staff, who had heard it from the concierge, who had witnessed it directly, what had happened that evening in the Jasmine Room. Marzetti had held his usual Thursday dinner. Ferretti had attended, as he always did, and so had 8 other men, and so had Carver, the one whose name Vera had heard in the alcove. At some point during the meal, Marzetti had placed something on the table in front of Ferretti. Documents, specific ones. Ferretti had looked at them. Then he'd looked at Marzetti. Marzetti had said, in a voice that the concierge described as perfectly level, "Get out of my city." No raised voice, no drama. Just those 5 words and the weight of everything he didn't need to say alongside them. Ferretti had left. So had the man who'd been with him in the hallway. They had not come back. Vera heard all of this and felt something strange move through her. Not pride, exactly, not relief. Something more complicated than either. Something that sat in her chest and didn't have a name yet. 2 days later, Marzetti called her into his private office. She'd been in it once before, briefly, to fix a stuck window. It was a real office, not a performance of one. Books with broken spines, actual paper on the desk, a half-eaten sandwich that suggested he'd worked through lunch. She liked it more than she expected to. He was on the phone when she arrived. He held up one finger, "Wait," and finished the call in 3 sentences. Efficient. She appreciated that. "I want to offer you a different position," he said. She waited. "I need someone at the hotel I can trust to notice things, to be present in rooms where people talk, and to tell me when something doesn't fit." He leaned back in his chair. "You're already doing a version of this. I'm asking you to do it with more purpose and more pay." Vera looked at him for a long moment. "You want me to be an informant in my own workplace," she said. "I want you to be an observer," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "An informant reports everything. An observer uses judgment." He held her gaze. "I think you have good judgment." She didn't answer immediately. She thought about the practical things first, the way she always did. About her mother, about the specialist, about the number. She thought about what this would mean and what it would cost and what it would require from her. Then she thought about something he'd said in the garden corridor. Why would I assume that? The question had stayed with her for 2 days, because no one asked her that. No one wondered why she might be doubted. They just went ahead and doubted her. He'd asked it like it was a genuine question, like he was actually interested in the answer. "I have conditions," she said. Something in his expression changed. Not quite a smile. She suspected that was a rare event, but a shift, a loosening. "Name them," he said. "The first month was strange. Not bad, just strange." She kept doing her regular work because that was the cover and also because she was good at it and quitting felt wrong. But now she also paid attention in a different way, less defensively, more deliberately. She started keeping notes, small ones in a notebook she bought at the drugstore on Chartres Street. Observations, patterns, things that didn't fit. She turned out to be good at it in ways that surprised even her. She had spent 3 years learning the rhythms of the hotel. who arrived early, who stayed late, who took phone calls in the stairwell, who ordered the same thing for breakfast every morning except on Tuesdays. She had accumulated this information the way you accumulate coins when you have nowhere to spend them. Passively, uselessly, because your hands needed something to do. It had never occurred to her that any of it was valuable. Marzetti, it turned out, was very interested in rhythm breaks. In the Tuesday exceptions, he told her this during one of their meetings. They met twice a week now, briefly, in a service room off the East Corridor, and she understood something she hadn't before, that the kind of power he had didn't come from being feared. It came from being attentive, from noticing. She had been doing that her whole life. She just hadn't known anyone was paying for it. There was a moment about 6 weeks in that she would think about afterward. Not the most dramatic moment, and not the most consequential, that came later, but the one that meant something. She had been restocking the mini-bar refrigerators on the 4th floor when Marzetti's associate, a man called Harwick, who wore expensive watches and had bad manners, came around the corner and nearly walked into her. He pulled back with the expression she knew well, the quick recalibration, the decision about whether to be annoyed or simply dismissive, and settled on the latter. "Careful," he said, not particularly to her, and kept walking. She had experienced 1,000 versions of this. She had, over years, developed a thick and well-mortared wall around the place where it used to sting. She resumed her work. She counted bottles. She moved to the next room. That evening, in the service room meeting, she mentioned Harwick. Something she'd noticed about his schedule. An irregularity that might or might not be relevant. Marzetti listened. Then he said, without looking up from his notes, "What do you think of him?" She paused. "As a person or as a risk?" "Both," she considered. "As a person, he's the kind of man who only counts what he can see in front of him. As a risk," she thought about the schedule irregularity. "Same problem, he doesn't look sideways." Marzetti nodded. Then he said, "He spoke to you in the hallway today." She looked at him. "He nearly bumped into me." What did he say? Careful, how did he say it? She found herself describing it, the expression, the dismissal, the quality of being looked past. She described it plainly, without editorializing, the way she always tried to. When she finished, Marzetti put down his pen. "I want to be clear about something," he said. She waited. "What you do here, what you see, what you notice, it's because of how you move through this building. And you move through it the way you do because people decide when they look at you that you don't count." He paused. "I'm aware of that. I want you to know that I'm aware of it." She didn't say anything for a moment. "Is that an apology?" she said finally. "It's an acknowledgement," he said, "for what it's worth." She thought about it. "It's worth something," she said. "The real test came in February. There was a man named Dell who had been staying at the hotel for 11 days under a corporate account that didn't exist. Vera had noticed him on day 3. By day 5, she'd noticed he left his room every morning at 8 and returned at 10, which was not unusual, but he always brought a different newspaper, which suggested he was acquiring them somewhere rather than retrieving them from the lobby, which was the only place the hotel stocked them. By day 7, she noticed that his towels were always refolded a certain way when she came in to replace them, which meant he was checking the room for evidence of entry. By day 9, she told Marzetti. On day 11, Dell was very politely asked to check out early by 2 of Marzetti's men, who explained the situation to him in terms she wasn't privy to. She saw him leave from the 3rd-floor window, carrying his bag, walking quickly. He didn't look back. She felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, something quieter, the particular satisfaction of a thing done well, a skill used correctly. Like fixing the television remote in 408, except at a different scale entirely. Marzetti told her about it that evening. He told her more than she expected, more than was strictly necessary, and she understood that this was a form of respect. Not treating her like a mechanism that needed to produce output, but like a person who'd contributed something and deserved to know how it had landed. "You're very good at this," he said. "I've been practicing for a long time," she said. "I just didn't know that's what I was doing." He looked at her for a moment. "How long have you been invisible?" The question caught her off guard, not because it was unkind, it wasn't, because it was accurate, because he'd seen the thing clearly and named it without dressing it up, and she hadn't expected that from him. "Long enough," she said, "that I stopped noticing it bothered me. Does it still?" She thought about it. Honestly, less than it used to, she said. "Some days more than others." He nodded. He didn't offer a platitude or a reassurance, which she appreciated more than she could say. "For what it's worth," he said, "I notice you." She looked at him. "I'm aware," he continued, "that that's a strange thing to say, given our arrangement. I'm not saying it to be manipulative. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I think you've spent enough time not hearing it." Vera was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," she said finally. "That does help. Good." He reached for the folder on the desk. "Now, tell me about the man in 612 who's been ordering room service twice a day, but leaving his trays untouched." She almost smiled. "I was going to bring that up." In March, her mother had the surgery. Marzetti paid for it. She hadn't asked him to. She had mentioned, in passing, she still didn't know why, some lapse in her usual careful guardedness, that there was a specialist her mother needed, and the cost was significant and the timeline was tight. She'd mentioned it the way you mention things to fill silence when you're tired. She came to work the next day and found an envelope on the service cart with her name on it. Not given by him directly, not made into a thing. Just placed there quietly. She went home that evening and sat in her apartment on Burgundy Street for a long time. She thought about what it meant to be seen. Not the performance of it, not the announcement of it, but the actual practice of paying attention to another person and then acting on what you'd noticed. She had spent years doing that for other people. She had never quite expected it to be done back. Her mother had the surgery in the second week of March. She came through it well. Vera took 3 days off to be with her, and Marzetti rearranged 2 meetings around it without being asked. She thought about that too. What happened in April was not something either of them planned. There was a dinner, a significant one, with men who mattered in ways that had implications beyond the hotel. Vera was working the service staff that night, which meant she was in and out of the private dining room every 20 minutes, invisible in the way she'd always been, carrying things, removing things, being present without being present. At some point during the evening, a man at the table, she didn't know his name, had never seen him before, was not sure she was supposed to, said something that made her go still. He said a name she recognized from her notebook, a name that should not have been connected to what he was describing. She finished her circuit of the table. She went into the kitchen. She put down the tray she was carrying and stood at the counter for exactly 30 seconds and thought through what she'd just heard, its implications, and what to do about it. Then she picked up her tray and went back into the dining room. She waited until Marzetti's glass was nearly empty before approaching to refill it. She leaned in slightly as she poured, not enough to draw attention, just enough to speak quietly. And she said, in a voice so low only he could hear it, "Harwick, Solis. There's a connection. I'll explain after." She straightened. She moved to the next glass. She did not look at Marzetti's face. She didn't need to. After the dinner, after the guests had gone and the staff were clearing the tables and the kitchen was running through its closing routine, Marzetti found her in the service corridor. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it. The name, the connection, what it meant if she was reading it correctly. He listened with that particular stillness she had learned to understand. Not blankness, but focus, the kind that came from a mind processing at speed. When she finished, he looked at her for a long moment. "You didn't react," he said. "In the room, no, how?" She thought about it. I grew up learning that reacting was dangerous, she said. You learn to keep everything internal. You keep your face neutral and you process on the inside. She paused. It used to be a defense mechanism. Turns out it's useful for other things. He was quiet. The thing they never understood, she said, more to herself than to him, is that being overlooked doesn't make you blind. It just makes you quiet. She looked up. I've been watching this hotel for 3 years. I watched it before you ever asked me to. There's not a person on the permanent guest list whose habits I don't know. I know, he said. I've known that for a while. She looked at him. Then, why are you looking at me like that? He seemed to realize he was doing something with his expression that he hadn't intended. He looked away briefly, which was something she'd never seen him do. Because, he said finally, I keep being surprised, and I've spent 30 years as not being surprised by people. She didn't know what to do with that. So she did the thing she always did when she didn't know what to do, which was to keep going. Harwick is the more immediate problem, she said. What do you want to do about it? He looked back at her. Something in his face settled, not into blankness, but into a different kind of attention, one that had her in it. What do you think we should do? He said. She noticed the word, we. She thought about it carefully, the way she always did. All the angles, all the outcomes, all the things she'd observed over months that pointed in various directions. She told him what she thought. She gave him her real analysis, not the careful version, not the diplomatic version, the one that was actually true. He listened. He asked questions. They worked through it together for an hour in the service corridor, her in her uniform and him in his dinner clothes, talking the problem down to its bones. At the end of it, he looked at her and said, "That's what we'll do." What happened next came 3 days later, in the lobby of the Hargrove Grand, in front of 12 people who happened to be in it at the time. Marzetti had called a meeting of his associates, the real ones, the ones who mattered, not the decorative ones. They gathered in the lobby because it was neutral ground, which was his choice, and she only understood why later. She was working behind the reception desk, covering for a colleague who was out sick. He walked in with them, 8 men in expensive suits, and crossed the lobby toward the private corridor. And then he stopped. He turned around. He walked to the reception desk. She looked up and found him looking at her in the way he'd been looking at her for months now, the real way, not the way people looked at a hotel employee, in front of every person's in that room. "Miss Dunne," he said, not loudly, not performatively, just clearly. "Mr. Marzetti," she said, "I want you to join this meeting." The lobby went very quiet. She was aware of the 8 men behind him, and the concierge 3 feet to her left, and the 2 guests who had paused near the elevator. "I'm on the desk," she said. "Dell can cover," he said. "I want your read on what we're discussing." He held her gaze. "You'll understand more of it than most of the people in that room." She came around from behind the desk. She walked into that meeting beside him, in her work uniform, and nobody in the room said a word. Not because they had nothing to say, but because Luca Marzetti was looking at them in a way that made them decide not to. He introduced her by name, just her name, no qualifiers, no explanation, as if it were obvious. She sat down. The meeting began. She thought about it later, walking home through the French Quarter in the early evening, when the light was the particular gold that made New Orleans look like a painting of itself. She thought about 3 years of moving quietly through rooms, of being the person no one bothered to guard themselves around, of turning invisibility into something functional just to survive. She thought about Marzetti saying, "We in a service corridor." She thought about her mother, recovering well, walking without the limp now, calling on Sundays to report on the progress of her garden. She thought about the notebook on her nightstand, full of observations that had turned out to matter. None of it was what she'd planned. She'd planned on surviving, on keeping her head down long enough to get her mother through, on being useful enough not to be discarded, on staying quiet in rooms where people talked, That had been the whole of her ambition, and she'd thought it was enough. She walked past a bar she knew, and a bookshop she liked, and the corner where a street musician was playing something slow and sweet and slightly sad. She stopped for a moment and listened. A woman dropped $1 in the case. The musician nodded without breaking the song. Vera stood there in the gold light and thought about what it meant to be seen. Not rescued, not elevated, not apologized to, just seen, accurately and consistently, and without performance. The way you saw someone when you were paying real attention. She had given that to other people her whole life, and had learned not to expect it back. She started walking again. Her notebook was waiting at home, and she had 3 observations from the dinner that she still needed to write down while they were fresh. And there was a meeting tomorrow that she needed to prepare for, and the musician's song followed her half a block before the city swallowed it whole. She walked through the gold light of New Orleans with her head up, and no one looked past her, and she was precisely and completely herself. Which was, she was beginning to understand, more than enough.